La edición extraordinaria de uno de los sobresalientes del Perú. Más de 70 sesiones de acceso gratuito con personalidades de diversas áreas del conocimiento. Literatura, ciencias, artes y actualidad para el público en general. Temas tratados por reconocidos autores y notables representantes nacionales e internacionales del pensamiento contemporáneo. Charlas, talleres y espectáculos, así como un variado programa para niños. Una oferta disponible en nuestras plataformas, desde un país ávido de compartir su patrimonio material e inmaterial, con todos sus saberes y sabores. High Festival Digital Arequipa 2020. Imagina el mundo.
Hola a todos. En nombre de la editorial Paidós y del Grupo Planeta, quiero daros la bienvenida al ciclo Conversaciones 75 aniversario de Paidós, en el marco del High Festival Digital Arequipa de este año 2020. También quiero agradecer a los compañeros del High el cariño con el que han acogido los actos de este aniversario. En estas conversaciones tenemos el privilegio de contar con Iñaki Gabilondo, periodista de referencia en España con 6 premios Ondas en su haber. Hoy, Iñaki conversará con Naomi Klein, a la cual también queremos agradecer su participación en este aniversario. Naomi Klein es una periodista galardonada, activista y autora de varios libros de referencia y bestseller internacional, entre los que podemos contar Nólogo, La doctrina de shock y de próxima publicación el libro En llamas. Como periodista, su trabajo de investigación y denuncia la han convertido en una de las voces referentes a nivel internacional y sus artículos se han publicado en los medios más importantes del mundo. También es corresponsal senior de la revista The Intercept. En la actualidad, Naomi Klein ostenta la cátedra inaugural Gora Steinem de Comunicación, Estudios Culturales y Feminismo de la Universidad de Rutgers. Queremos agradecerles a los dos que compartan esta conversación con nosotros y también queremos agradeceros a todos vosotros vuestra atención. Muchísimas gracias y hasta pronto.
Naomi Klein, es un placer saludarle. Y quisiera preguntar antes que nada si este libro, decir no, no basta, no is no enough, nos presenta a una Naomi más esperanzada que indignada, porque el libro presenta una gran cantidad de datos para la indignación, pero al tiempo es también una incitación muy positiva, muy esperanzadora. ¿Cuáles son los dos sentimientos? ¿Cómo hemos de medir estos dos sentimientos? Su indignación y su esperanza.
Yes. You know, I think I feel both emotions many times a day. And I think there is a lot to be indignant about and rage at injustice. Is a powerful motivating force. So is fear of an even worse future. So is love of the people and places that we want to protect. But I don't think we can move forward with fear and anger alone. I think we need a destination. I think we need a picture of a world that is better than the present to motivate us. And so I try to have a balance. I call it sort of, credible hope. So it's not a hope that is not tempered by reality. It isn't a hope that is saying, oh, I'm sure we're going to win. I'm not. I know our chances are slim, but it is also a refusal to give up because the stakes are too high.
Por de pronto, en el libro nos recuerda Naomi que todo lo que usted pronosticó en No Logo o todo lo que usted pronosticó en la teoría del shock ha empeorado 20 años después. Lo que usted dijo que iba a significar esta especie de colonización de las marcas ha ido mucho más lejos de lo que usted hubiera podido imaginar hace 20 años. Y se centra mucho en el caso de Donald Trump, que se ha convertido en el perfecto representante de lo que usted hace 20 años, en cierto sentido, insinuaba.
Yes, I mean, maybe you're speaking to me because you're under the impression I'm influential, but obviously nobody listens to me because I've been warning about these things for some time, and things have only gotten worse and gone further down that road. There's no doubt that Trump is an expression of what I wrote about in No Logo, of the rise of the branding form of capitalism, where it's about selling an idea as opposed to a product. And now that we have more information about Trump's finances, because his tax returns have been leaked to the New York Times finally, everything that I said in that book, we now have a great deal more evidence of, that Trump was a terrible businessman. He lost money every time he owned anything. The only time he ever made money was when he sold his name to other people who knew how to run a business. So Trump is the quintessential, he's all marketing. You know, there's no there. It's all illusion. But he's very good at marketing, and he's very good at branding. This is what he does. He's not good at building buildings. He's not good at running golf resorts. I mean, these are all losing money. He's not good at running casinos. What he is good at doing is managing the Trump brand, the illusion, and selling a fantasy to people who feel powerless, who are unhappy with their lives, and want to disappear into a fantasy of power and privilege. And that is how he built his brand, as a developer, then as a television star, but he continues to do this as a president. And I think that Democrats continue to misunderstand the nature of Trump's power. They keep telling themselves that if they catch Trump lying or cheating, that somehow it's going to hurt him. But all it does is reinforce his brand, which is the brand of being powerful enough and smart enough and rich enough to be able to get away with anything, including not paying any taxes.
¿Cree usted que ganará las elecciones?
I'm absolutely terrified that he will win the elections. Yeah. I mean, I hope he will not win the elections, but and I don't just hope. I mean, I am also trying to encourage people who are discouraged after having been part of the Bernie Sanders campaign or the Elizabeth Warren campaign and feel very discouraged about Joe Biden. I'm trying to encourage those people to hold their noses and vote for Biden, because we have to stop Trump. I believe that he is, much more dangerous than just a good marketer and a good self-promoter. His brand is about domination. His brand is really a kind of a supremacist brand. It always has been. He's selling an image of himself as a kind of this sort of old school patriarch, right? If you think about The Apprentice and what was going on his show, his television show. Here you have this head of the family, head of the business. All of his kids are working for him. Everybody's blonde. Everybody's fits a certain look. And they're constantly exercising power over other people. This is why white supremacists believe that Trump is with them, and he sends them signs that he is with them. This is why, even though he's a sinner, and has had 3 marriages, the Christian nationalists believe he's with them. There's a coded connection there. And Trump's base comes from people who are very, very serious about this sort of white Christian supremacy. And so another term of Trump, I think, would be absolutely terrifying for women, for immigrants, for Black people, for gays and lesbians, for anybody outside of that, that prototypical Christian family. And so we have to stop him, and I think it's a lot like, what French voters have faced when they've needed to vote for neoliberal candidates to stop the Front National, or whatever they're called now. So there are moments when we have to hold our noses and vote. The concern is that kind of a vote is never going to be as enthusiastic as when people are voting for something, not just against something. You're holding up a book called No Is Not Enough. I really believed that the Democrats needed a positive vision for a better world that acknowledged the pain that Trump was tapping into in 2016, right? The impacts of bad trade deals, the deindustrialization, the economic precarity. We needed a candidate who could speak to that and motivate people, but that's not who we got. We got a representative of the pre-Trump order, right? That is who Joe Biden is. His entire claim to fame is, I was Barack Obama's vice president. So it's very much a campaign of no to Trump. And that's what we've got. So that's what we've got to work with. So wish us luck.
También aterroriza mucho la posibilidad de que Donald Trump no gane, pero no acepte el resultado e introduzca a la democracia norteamericana en un túnel de meses de mucha vacilación y de mucha tensión en las calles. Ese es un riesgo que existe también.
Yeah, I mean, this is the reason why we need voter enthusiasm, because the only way to push back this tidal wave of really dangerous, well-armed supremacist forces of various kinds that Trump has emboldened, right? And organized and winked to, he said during the debate, the first debate, about the Proud Boys, these white supremacists, this racist organization, stand down, stand by, as in, I'll call you when I need you, right? Don't make trouble during the election, but stand by. And so, Trump during this period has really emboldened these militia forces. They're really, some of them are just overt terrorist organizations. If they were Black, if they were brown people and not white people, they would absolutely be called terrorists. They're walking through the streets heavily armed. They're going to, in some cases, state government houses, like in Michigan, protesting having to wear masks and the shutdowns during the coronavirus. They stormed the state legislature, right, with machine guns. And Trump has been encouraging these people. So in order to push back this whole sort of tidal wave that is coming, Biden needs to not just win by a few votes. I mean, Biden needs a decisive victory. And so, you know, that's the only scenario which is a good scenario, because even a marginal victory is going to lead to so much mayhem. And of course, a Trump victory leads to an emboldened Trump, right? I mean, I always tell people, don't tell yourself that a second term of Trump is a seamless continuation of the first term of Trump, because the way authoritarian figures interpret a second electoral mandate is as permission to take the gloves off and do everything that they didn't dare do in their first term. And if we want to know what that looks like, look at Modi. You know, Modi was pretty aggressive towards Muslims, for instance, in his first term. But it was immediately after he won a second election that he moved to strip citizenship of millions of Muslims, that he locked down Kashmir, cut them off completely, including the internet. So, you know, if we think that the way Trump has treated migrants from Central America has been brutal, you know, now we have to understand that, you know, as Michelle Obama said during the Democratic convention, don't tell yourself that things can't get worse, because they can. So, you know, we have to like, I know you're outside of the United States, and you're watching all of this helplessly, but a lot of people in the United States and North America are working very, very hard to try to get an enthusiastic turnout against fascism and for democracy. You know, Bernie Sanders, who I, you know, supported in the primaries, said it's not an election between Trump and Biden, it's an election between Trump and democracy. And I think if enough people really understand that, then we could have an enthusiastic turnout. But obviously, I believe that it would have been more enthusiastic if Bernie had been the candidate.
En España entendemos bien y seguimos bastante bien el fenómeno, porque además su denuncia, históricamente, y también en este libro, va más allá de Donald Trump. Donald Trump es la manifestación de un pensamiento, la manifestación de un proyecto, la manifestación de una idea que está avanzando con la voluntad de destruir el estado de bienestar tal como lo hemos construido, de manera que Trump sería, digamos, la manifestación de ese pensamiento. Pero lo que usted quiere que entendamos, creo, es que hemos de combatir contra ese pensamiento y que ese pensamiento va mucho más allá de Trump y que está actuando en muchos frentes simultáneamente. Es decir, Trump es muy importante, pero es solo la punta del iceberg de ese movimiento y ese proyecto que usted denuncia. ¿Le interpreto correctamente?
Absolutely. I think that there is a kind of a club now, and you have people like Steve Bannon going in between, and you've seen this in Southern Europe. But yeah, there's a club of these you know, far right leaders, whether it's Salvini or, you know, or Bolsonaro or Duterte or Modi or Netanyahu. They are in communication with one another, supporting one another. You know, Trump had Modi in Texas at a huge rally called Howdy Modi, you know. You see the alliance between Modi and Netanyahu, obviously between Trump and Netanyahu. And these are not just friendships, right? These are lines of communication and strategy and technology, right? Where there are strategists who are working for multiple campaigns that are counseling on how best to use Facebook, WhatsApp, how to marshal the powers of fake news, all of these tactics of divide and conquer, surveillance technologies. And and a kind of a playbook. And, this is what I try to get at, in the last couple of books I've written, but it's a very familiar playbook of, coming to power with a nostalgic vision of when the country used to be great and who the real citizens of the country are, and sharply defining that in-group, right? So for Trump, that in-group is, the real Americans, meaning white, meaning Christian, meaning straight. But, for Modi, it's the Hindus who are the real Indians against the Muslims. And all of these, for Duterte, it's all about, the drug dealers and, all the people he's cast as subhuman. We know this playbook. This is the fascist playbook. And so you have your in-group, and then you have your out-group. And the out-group is both within the border of the country. So, in Europe, it's the Roma have played this role. But then there's the other out. Then there's the out-group at the border, who the refugee, the migrant. And this is what fuels the fire. This is what gives the in-group a sense of dominance, of power. And so even if these figures are not making life actually better for the people who vote for them, and in many cases are making it worse, because if you look at where the coronavirus, has been worse, it is in the countries led by these bullies, because of course, contagious diseases do not respond to being ordered around by strongmen. They do what they do. And so we've seen the virus spread, Brazil, India, the United States. These are the countries with the highest infection rates. And so, but it doesn't really matter that they aren't taking care of their in-group, because the source of their power is the promise of being in a higher rung and having somebody to bully and having somebody to target. And so, Trump it's not just about Trump. It is about, I think, how humanity is going to respond to a moment of profound intersecting crises. Climate is one of them. Pandemics is another, which is also related to our devouring of the natural world. And we have more of these diseases that are jumping from animals to humans, and our inability to contain them. We have a very precarious economic system that, in the name of efficiency, has taken out all of its abilities to absorb shocks. So anywhere there's a shock, it creates a crisis through the whole system. And so we are in a moment of profound economic insecurity, ecological insecurity. And one of the ways that humans respond to fear is with this intensely tribal self-protection, and the othering of anybody outside of that tribe. And so that is why in this moment we're seeing a rise of these figures. And that is why they can't be defeated simply by calling names and saying they're bad and mean. There has to be another vision for how we live safely and humanely on this planet, and how we share what is left of habitable space on this planet, because more and more of this planet is being made uninhabitable through climate disruption and economic cruelty. And that is why people are migrating. And so how are we going to respond to that? How are we going to respond to that reality? And so this is really a profound moment of choice for humans, where we have to decide if we are going to respond to this moment of unraveling by first actually getting at the reasons why we are in crisis. And that means a Green New Deal. It means getting our economies off of fossil fuels very, very, very quickly, getting emissions down to zero really, really quickly. But it also means making sure that we are addressing this fundamental insecurity by putting in a kind of a floor for people, saying, okay, everybody is going to have healthcare. You don't need to worry about that. You're going to have healthcare no matter what. You're going to have housing no matter what. You're going to have food no matter what. So addressing the basics around food insecurity, housing insecurity, water insecurity, because when people are frightened about the basics of life, that is when it is really easy to get people to turn on each other and just take care of themselves and their families. We saw it with the coronavirus, people got afraid. They immediately went to supermarkets and bought all the toilet paper and all of the food, because that sort of animal instinct of, I must take care of my own, right? So we have a society to take care of each other, to say, okay, it's not everybody for themselves. We are going to take care of each other through crisis. And that is what allows us to be human in these moments and not just brutal.
Me ha parecido muy interesante el análisis que usted hace de la lucha que propone. Cometemos un error, dice. Algunos se empeñan en la lucha contra el racismo, la lucha feminista, otros la lucha ecologista, la lucha contra la inmigración, como si pudieran ser separables. Y usted dice, no son separables. Es una lucha integral. Parcelar el combate es equivocarse. Todos son eslabones de una misma cadena. Me parece una idea muy interesante.
Yeah, I think we need a genuinely holistic vision of the future. And I think that it's been a while since we have taken that mandate really seriously. Often when you listen to politicians, on the left, they make lists, they're checking off all the people that they are ignoring. This person, this group, that group, that group. But a list is not a story. A list is a list, I think that the Salvinis of the world and the Trumps of the world and the Bolsonaros of the world, they have a story. It's a story of supremacy. It's a story of, you are better than those other people. Those other people are where they are because of their failings, their moral failings, their genetic failings. You are where you are because you are inherently better. And there's, if you're religious, there's even a whole other layer of really building God's kingdom on earth, and that all of these fires and floods and diseases, these are signs. These are signs that God is unhappy, right? There's a narrative. It's a very destructive narrative, I believe. I think the apocalyptic fantasy is one of the most powerful fantasies ever created in the human mind, right? And we need stories that challenge that apocalyptic fantasy, that actually say, no, here is a story for how we come together in crisis. Here is a story that connects us, and also gives us a kind of a mission in this moment. I talk about our moving from an economy of endless extraction, of endless, of taking from human bodies and from the earth as if there's no consequence, a kind of an ethos of carelessness, the opposite of care, to one of care and repair, that these should be the fundamental purposes of our economy, is to take care of each other, to take care of the natural world, and to repair the damage that has been done. We have a huge mess to clean up ecologically. And also, I think, there's so many people who have been broken by this system. Many of them are boarding boats to try to come to Europe. And many of them are turning to addictive drugs to try to get through. I mentioned the apocalyptic imagination in religion being very, very powerful, right? There's another religious tradition, which is repair. Repairing the world, repairing the brokenness, reconstruction, rebuilding. And I think we need to harness those stories to connect the dots between the work of repair in our infrastructure, the hospitals, the schools that have been tested in this moment of the pandemic, and we see how badly broken they were. I mean, how many public hospitals suffered under decades of austerity and were cut to the bone, and then the coronavirus hit, and they couldn't handle it. And so many people died in Spain, in Italy, of course, in the United States. But it didn't have to happen. You know, when you look at who died in New York City, if you were in a private hospital, you most likely survived the coronavirus. There were very few fatalities. If you were in a public hospital serving poor people, that was where the deaths happened, because there were not enough nurses. There were not enough ventilators. It had already been cut to the bone. So we have a huge repair job in our infrastructures of care, the institutions that we built to take care of each other, to take care of the elderly, to take care of the sick, to take care of the young. We need to rebuild that, and we need to repair the damage done to the natural world. We need to rehabilitate habitat for animals, and we will have fewer viruses jumping from animals to humans if we take that work seriously. And we, you know, I believe in North America, we have a huge amount of work to do in reparation to Indigenous people and to Black people on whose lands and bodies our entire economy was built. And I believe there is healing in that. You know, I'm not afraid of that reparation work. I think there's liberation in it. And so that's where I feel like the work of organizing and the work of theorizing, there has to be narrative in it. There has to be story in it, because the people we're up against have stories, and they're dangerous stories, and they're getting more dangerous every day because they believe they're in the end times and they believe they're fine. And whether their kingdom is a luxury, you know, apartment building or mansion with private security down here on earth, or whether it's a gated heaven in the sky where they're going to get saved while everybody else burns, it's the same fantasy. It's the fantasy of, I'm safe, forget you.
Aprender a vivir en la tierra y aprender a vivir con la tierra. Me gustaría, Naomi, que nos contara esa experiencia que usted extrajo de unas tribus sioux que le contaron, que le ayudaron a entender ese concepto, el concepto de vivir con la tierra, reconstruir nuestra relación con la tierra, que la tenemos completamente equivocada. Tenemos que aprender de esas tribus o de esas personas que han mantenido un contacto muy real con la tierra en el momento en el que tenemos tan graves problemas en nuestra relación con la naturaleza.
Yeah, so you're talking about the Standing Rock Sioux in the United States, and that was an amazing experience, where there was a pipeline running that was proposed to run through their territory, and a huge movement, mostly Indigenous people, but also non-Indigenous people, came together to try to block that pipeline. And the movement was victorious under Obama, but then when Trump came to power, he moved to reverse it, and then the courts sided with the Standing Rock Sioux again recently, and now that's being challenged. But the experience of coming together over a period of months on the land to try to stop the pipeline was not only about the pipeline, as many people who I quote in the book, I think you're referring to in particular LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, who is a Sioux elder and historian, and welcomed the first group of people to camp on her land. And she talked to me about how they believed that the whole reason why the Sioux had protected their ways of understanding what humans are on this earth to do and what our relationship to nature should be, and the ceremonies and the practices, the reason why they had kept them alive over hundreds of years of attempted genocide was to be able to teach them when people were ready to hear them, when the rest of of people on this land were ready to hear them, because they always knew that the European settler relationship to the land was going to lead to collapse, was going to lead to disaster, and that there would have to be a process of relearning to live with the land. And that is something I've heard from Indigenous people around the world, that idea that they're protecting ways of knowing. I heard it from Indigenous people in Australia, and I often hear it from Indigenous people in Canada as well. And there are changes that are happening. I live right now. I've moved back to Canada from the United States, and I'm living in British Columbia. I hadn't been here for a few months, and when we came back in June, all the street signs had been changed, and now the original Indigenous name for all the places is the name on the highway, on the street signs, and the English language one is underneath it in brackets. And that, that seems like a small thing, but it's I think it's where we are finally actually arriving in this place. This idea that we were discovering a land that was uninhabited was the European mythology. The place I live is called British Columbia, right? I was born in what used to be called New France. These are all places that just took European names and said, well, we found an extra Europe here, right? And so, and this was obviously true of Spanish colonizers as well. And so we are starting to shed the European names that were never the names of these places, and remember what was here before, and learn from the people who never forgot, right? And my son is now going to school at the local school. I dropped him off on Wednesday, and it was amazing. All the kids were out there singing a song led by one of their teachers who is Indigenous from here, and she was drumming, and they were singing the water song, and she was telling them that they are all each other's relatives, and they are all related to all of the birds and the crickets and the salmon. This never would have been taught in school. Never. Just a few years ago, right? The idea that humans are in relationship, literally related to, in relationship, family, with all of the living creatures in their ecosystem, right? And now this is being taught in public schools. And so things are changing in little ways. The question is, will they change fast enough, given the speed of unraveling, fast enough to save, people? Then the world will survive. The planet will survive. Because I will also say that on the same day that I dropped my son off, the air quality was so bad that they had to shut all the windows because of the wildfires. But they're supposed to open the windows because of the coronavirus. So they had to choose between opening the windows because of the coronavirus or closing the windows because of the wildfire smoke.
Se toman medidas poco a poco, interesantes. El mundo tiene una mayor sensibilidad que tenía ante los temas medioambientales. Hace muchos años eran unos pocos los que hacían esta denuncia. Ahora ya los grandes países ya, en principio, reconocen que hay una lucha que librar. Pero ¿cree usted que se puede cambiar si no cambiamos nuestra manera de vivir? Es decir, el crecimiento infinito en un mundo limitado es posible. ¿Podemos alterar las cosas sencillamente con cambios estructurales, políticos, etcétera, si no cambiamos nuestra manera de vivir, nuestra manera de consumir, nuestra manera de disfrutar, nuestra manera de gastar?
Look, all I can say is that I believe that this pandemic that we're all still in the grips of, it should be it should be a catalyst for transformation. Because I believe the way we should see the coronavirus is as not as an enemy. We hear this from politicians all the time. They're waging war on an unseen enemy. COVID-19 is the enemy. I think we should see COVID-19 as a teacher, as a very tough, difficult teacher. And I use this language because I first heard it when I was in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And many Puerto Ricans I spoke with when they talked about Hurricane Maria as our teacher. They said, she's tough. She showed us a lot. And people there were trying to learn the lessons of that disaster, right? This unveiling, right? This is what these moments of crisis are. They pull the veil back and we see, what do we see, right? We see that we have allowed our hospitals, our schools, our infrastructure to decay. We see that we have abused the people who care for us and our loved ones. We have not cherished them. We've not valued them. We see that we have lost the skill, the ability to take care of our basic needs, our medical supplies, our food. It's all being shipped from far away and very vulnerable to any kind of crisis. We see that what's most important is not stuff, is not more things to buy. It's the health of our loved ones. What do we miss? If you talk to people during lockdown, what did you miss most? Friends, family, being able to be outside. We took so much comfort in nature, birdsong, flowers in this period. We have to learn all of these lessons about what is truly essential in life, is what is essential labor, what we cannot live without. And it's not shopping. It's not shopping for more stuff. That is not the lesson of COVID-19. And we also learned lessons about our interdependence, right? That we are not islands of self-sufficiency, that everything we touch, other people have touched. And if they aren't healthy, if they are not cared for, if they're not able to go to the doctor, we're not safe either. And the other thing that we have been learning, although our leaders can't seem to learn it, is that every time we try to go back to the speed of capitalism as usual and chase after growth for growth's sake, the virus comes back. It surges back. And every time we go into these sort of industrial scale spaces, it also surges back. So we need to live at a different scale, at a more human scale. And we need to live more slowly. And, even if you just think about schools, right? You pack a bunch of kids into a class of 40 kids, and their desks all next to each other, and you don't invest in the ventilation system of the schools. Of course, the virus spreads in a situation like that. Or you pack people into a meat processing plant, or an Amazon warehouse, or you treat elderly people as if they don't matter in these sort of warehouses. That's where the virus spread. Everywhere that humans were being treated like machines or profit centers or of no value. So we have to learn all of these lessons. And one of the lessons is about growth. New Zealand has contained the virus better than almost anyone. They've had 25 deaths, right? 25 deaths in New Zealand. There were 25 deaths, every Wednesday in Ohio, since the pandemic began, 25 deaths, but their economy has shrunk by 12%, right? There is a relationship between economic growth reducing and the ability to control this virus. So what if we figured out how to live differently and the purpose of our economy was repair and care, not growth, not just more and more and more and more, but actually taking care of each other and cleaning up the messes we've made, I think we could have a good society, a good life, and a much safer one. So no, I don't think it's compatible. I don't think it's possible to just continue to consume in that same way and not be at war with life on Earth, but also not be at tremendous risk ourselves, right? I mean, this is what the pandemic has done, is it's brought the ecological crisis into our bodies.
¿Cree que recordaremos estas lecciones? ¿Cree que este mensaje que nos ha traído la pandemia, esa maestra tan dura, nos ayudará a corregir el rumbo o cambiará los paradigmas, quiero decirle? ¿O sencillamente la máquina del desarrollo en marcha devorará las buenas intenciones y las buenas lecciones aprendidas?
I think it's a race against time, but I think we really need artists, we need storytellers, we need fighters and movements, and we need to try to tell the story of this moment. This has been we are living through something truly historic. It's in its global nature, in the way it has transformed every aspect of our lives and our economy. It takes a while for a society to metabolize something this big, right? It takes a while for artists to know how to talk about it. It takes a while for writers to write books about it. It takes a while for politicians to change their talking points about it, But that's what we have to do. We have to do it fast. We have to do it now. Because that machine, that rusty old machine of capitalism as usual is revving back up. And it's saying, let's get back to business as usual, only with far more death normalized, right? It's saying, stepping over the bodies of our grandparents and our loved ones in order to get back to this sort of grim pre-pandemic normal that was a crisis before this pandemic. That's a terrible, terrible future.
El llamamiento que hicieron es la hora de dar el salto, que lo hicieron en Canadá, pero que vale para cualquier lugar del mundo. Yo puedo decirle que yo he leído ese llamamiento que ustedes hicieron y siento perfectamente reconocido su mensaje porque vale para cualquier lugar de la Tierra. Me gustaría que me dijera qué eco han tenido. Después de ese llamamiento, ¿es la hora de dar el salto? ¿Qué han percibido que ha ocurrido?
Well, it's interesting. We launched the LEAP manifesto 5 years ago. And when we put it out, it was like a bomb exploding in the political culture. I mean, the reactions were, you would have thought that it was a terrorist manifesto, right? This was saying, the subtitle is Caring for Each Other and the Earth. And the premier of the province that I'm in now, British Columbia, she said it will wipe out hundreds of towns overnight, like as if it was like a nuclear explosion. She's no longer the premier. I'm glad to share. In fact, we have a coalition of the Greens and the Social Democrats who replaced her. We had a former prime minister say it was an existential threat to the country. And like the country will cease to exist if we start caring for each other and the planet. It's just so funny. And what I would say is that this document, which is short, it's 1,400 words, it's had this amazing life and it's had this influence around the world. And I think in the coronavirus moment, people understand what care means, right? Like that subtitle, Caring for Each Other and the Earth. Some people thought it was too soft. What does that mean? But I think after months of lockdown, when people have cheered for nurses and doctors and the people who do the labor of care and taken solace from the natural world, we understand better what that means, and that it really does call for a transformation in how we live and what we value. So I'm glad that it speaks to you. You know, it's funny. Like I think my hope is that those 1,400 words have more impact than anything else I've ever written. You know, people talk to me about the shock doctrine. Every time I hear somebody cite quote the shock doctrine, it just makes me sad. I just wish it wasn't still relevant. I wish people didn't still read it. I want us to think about our own relationship to shock. You know, shock should awaken us. Shock should catalyze us. Shock should push us to change, to transform ourselves, to grow up quickly. And that's the way I see the LEAP Manifesto, as a people's shock doctrine, right? This is how we should respond to crisis and shock.
Tengo aquí ese llamamiento y verdaderamente es breve, pero es muy motivador. Le quiero preguntar, para concluir, Naomi, sobre las generaciones más jóvenes. Los más jóvenes. A mí me parece que constituyen un enigma. Los chicos jóvenes, los que tienen ahora 13, 14, 15, 16, ¿qué deben estar pensando? No lo sabemos, porque hablamos de los jóvenes un poco más mayores, pero los chicos pequeños, ¿qué deben estar pensando? ¿Cree que ellos van a llegar a este mundo con una mentalidad distinta respecto a estas cosas? ¿O que serán también atrapados por este sistema que los ha atrapado a todos?
Or maybe they're less trapped. I think I think that, you know, the young people who I come into contact with in the climate movement, the student strikers, you know, inspired by Greta Thunberg, and also, you know, university-age students. I teach university-age students. I think that there is a real shift for the generation that has come into consciousness since the 2008 financial crisis. You know, the ones who were very young when that happened and have grown up in its shadow. Their imaginations are not as colonized as my generation's imagination was, because I grew up in the 80s, in the 90s, and it was a triumphant period for capitalism, and it was all it was the boundaries of what you were allowed to say and not say were so tightly policed within the kind of Cold War mentality. And all they have seen is collapse, economic collapse, ecological collapse. And as far as they're concerned, all the systems are a betrayal of them. You know, the political system that produced a Donald Trump or a Jair Bolsonaro. I mean, they don't respect the systems. And I think that's healthy, because those systems have failed us. And so, you know, we talked earlier about, you know, what I call silos, like keeping the issues in their little boxes, right? The racism, sexism, the environment, the economy, everything in its place. The biggest shift that I see with this younger generation is they are not interested in boxes. They hate all binaries. They don't want any boundaries, and they want that holistic analysis. The deeper, the better, you know? And so I think that there's a hunger for getting at the root, you know, the best kind of radicalism, going down to the root among young people. But there's also a lot of anger, I think, really understandable anger about feeling that they don't have a future, but they are fighting for a future. You know, that's what's beautiful. You know, when you see thousands and thousands or millions globally of young people striking for the future, They believe and know that they have a right to a future, and they're enraged at people who have destroyed or are in the process of destroying their prospects for a real future, to live well, to have their kids of their own, to be able to experience the beauty of this world and other species. They know they have that right. I'll tell you who I really feel sorry for: the old. I feel sorry for people in their 80s and 90s right now. I feel sorry for people who have been fighting for change all their lives. I know so many elders who have kept hope alive, tried to raise the alarm, tried to warn people, and are having to face the prospect of leaving this world in such a sad state, right? The comfort of old age is that it is part of a natural cycle. You leave this world, but life continues, right? And you become part of that cycle. And to leave this world and not know if that cycle is safe, if you are leaving the world in a state that is able to continue to regenerate life, that is the greatest tragedy I can fathom.
Bueno, pues efectivamente, vamos a mantener la esperanza en las nuevas generaciones que están, por un lado, atrapados por la tecnología de una manera absoluta, pero por otro lado tienen esperanza. Y si me permite, yo voy a acogerme a la esperanza de la última línea de su libro. Su hijo Toma, que no sé cuántos años tiene, pero dice una cosa muy bonita, que dice: Trump no puede ser presidente de los Estados Unidos porque es muy maleducado. Me ha parecido maravilloso, me ha parecido un golpe verdaderamente genial. ¿Cuántos años tiene Toma?
He is 8. He's 8. You know,
Es muy bonito. No puede ser Trump presidente de los Estados Unidos porque es muy maleducado. Me ha parecido muy bonito.
He's a good kid, and he really keeps us going. You know, as we try to imagine these different futures, he just eats it up. You know, I think that kids now need not just news of how bad things are, but pictures of how things can change. We made a little film. I don't know if maybe you can share it. It comes out tomorrow, actually. It's called Message from the Future 2. We made it during the pandemic. And it's a little short film about how we did listen to the pandemic. We did listen to the messages of this moment, and we did change, and we did bring in the years of repair. That's what we call it, the years of repair. And we showed it to our son Toma yesterday, and he watched it, and he said, "This is the first time since the pandemic started that I have been able to give myself over to anything." To really concentrate. And it was so interesting. But yeah, if you're looking for some hope, maybe you can end by playing that little bit, because it's our attempt to find some hope and make some art out of this moment.
Pues muchas gracias. Le ruego que me mande. Yo no tengo 7 años, sino muchos más, pero estoy seguro de que me va a venir muy bien el mensaje que ustedes hicieron. Muchas gracias.
Oh, gracias.
Looking back, it's hard to believe that we've rebuilt our community from the ground up with our own hands. The first seeds were planted way back in the terror and tenderness of the pandemic. And then change bloomed in the streets. in the fire and struggle of the uprisings. Around here, we'll never forget the day that the last prisoners were released, walking out into the arms of their loved ones. The easy part was finding work. The Community Care Corps was always looking for people in those days, whether for universal family care, burying border walls, or green new public housing, going up one pod at a time. Yep, it was a good time for busy hands.
Funny, thinking back to the first wave of the pandemic, that's what you really remember. Hands. Washing, scrubbing, disinfecting, washing again, picturing each other's hands, all the hands that had touched whatever we were touching, the hands that packed the box, that picked the tomato, that planted the seed, the hands that stroked the brow, that said goodbye. The hands were us, all of us. That web of hand-to-hand, breath-to-breath relationships was a reminder. We are all entangled, making each other sick, keeping each other alive. That was just one of the lessons of COVID-19. It started in the first great pause, when the smog cleared and the rich fled the cities, when poverty dropped its disguise and racist inequality drew the map of the disease. As the roar of the traffic faded, we arose to birdsong and ambulance sirens. The virus showed us what was truly essential. And we learned again and again that so many of us doing essential work were being treated as sacrificial. From nursing homes to detention facilities, meatpacking plants, and fulfillment centers, the virus exposed the cruelty of these warehouses of efficiency and profit. Then things got worse. In 2023, super droughts led to mega floods. Locusts carved a path across continents and hyper typhoons drove millions from their homes. COVID-23 raced through storm shelters and refugee camps. Supplies ran out again. Meanwhile, dinosaurs roamed the halls of power, bellowing that more sacrifice was needed. But every time they cranked up that rusty old machine called economic growth, the cloud of sickness and death grew.
And we couldn't breathe. Couldn't breathe from the asthma in our polluted communities, from the smoke of those fires. We couldn't breathe with a knee on our necks, in the clouds of tear gas as we shouted, "Black Lives Matter." And that is how the virus changed everything. We finally understood that we couldn't keep patching up the same broken systems. We had to build something new. What was needed was a spark. That spark was us. After months of organizing, the viral rent strike was like a starting gun. Then came the essential workers' strike. Delivery drivers, street cleaners, and farm workers got together and said, enough. This time, people didn't just clap from their balconies. We flooded into the streets to join together. One of the leaders was Luciela, a young food courier. When a police bullet stole her life, the crowds exploded in size and then exploded again, spreading across borders like a counter-virus. The sparks look different in every country as the wildfire strikes leapt across borders. Economies ground to a halt, this time blockaded by workers. We lost too many young heroes as states brought out the iron fist, but it was no match for the raised fist of solidarity. Soon, authoritarian rulers started to topple like statues, and new governments were suddenly nervous about ignoring the streets. We joined hands and pushed further, launching the years of repair.
The first step was rebuilding the economy around the core of essential work: food and farming, care for young and old, public health. Not to mention the essential labor of the more than human world, the winged pollinators, the leafy oxygen makers. The Full Employment Act made the new priorities clear, and there was a wave of new worker cooperatives in everything from mental health support to public art and tree planting. Many bosses were made redundant. Our information ecology needed tending too, and so we built a digital commons, vaccinated it against surveillance, and built up our herd immunity to disinformation. Fossil fuels were running on fumes by that point, so we harnessed their final profits to clean up their messes. Whatever we could, we did outdoors. School, theatre, celebrating, at first because it was safer, then because we realised it made us happier. Nobody talked about missing shopping. Anyway, the right to repair movement meant that a lot of stuff got fixed rather than thrown away and replaced. With life moving at a slower pace, we finally had time to look back, and we began the most important repair of all: repairing relationships. In colonial countries like the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK, those were hard conversations. But truth and reparations commissions helped some of us face the truth about the violent conquests of the past and how they shaped our world. That guided where we repaired and how. It turned out that once we fully funded schools and housing and healthcare, we didn't need those bloated budgets for policing, prisons, and war. And ultimately, the flow of money on planet Earth had to be reversed. So the North finally started paying its debts, and the South finally stopped.
Around here, the Land Back program began the historic process of returning some of the stolen land to indigenous jurisdiction. In the process, we remembered how taking care of the earth lays the ground for taking care of each other. Within just a few years, we could see the bottom of the river again, and it was safe to drink and fish in its waters. Things aren't perfect, of course. Between mutating viruses and our warming world, there's always new storms headed our way. But when they come, we're ready. With our networks of nurses and neighbors, our small farms and big forests, our systems of care and repair. No one is sacrificed. Everyone is essential.
Gracias por su donación. Preservar la cultura está en nuestras manos. Ayúdenos a afianzar nuestras acciones y continuar imaginando un mundo mejor.